Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Nick Kanoki, the Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I'm very excited for today's program with Peter Kohler, AMC Executive Council Liaison. Before we get underway, we just want to thank our ALN Platinum organizational member, Onuma System, and that is a new level of membership this year. So especially thank you to Onuma System. And we thank our ALN patron members as well as all our organizational members. And we really appreciate their continued support for programs like this and our newsletter. If you're interested in joining up, reach out to anyone at the ALN and we can talk how we can work together. Upcoming, we have a program next two Tuesdays from now, Managing Data as an Asset, Value and Benefits, with Kimon Onuma from Onuma System and John Hardwick. And I think with that, we will just say there's more programs upcoming, so stay tuned. And if you're out there today watching, we would love to hear you. So please send any comments, questions, or feedback to the chat, or you can use the Q&A function of this Zoom webinar. Mike Bordenero, Executive Director.
Thank
Hello.
you, Nick. How are things back in Lander, Wyoming?
Excellent. I mean, we're under snow, but we're pretty much dug out now since we've been back for a few days. So
great. And I do want to mention that Nick alluded to upcoming programs the following Tuesday after the value and benefits from asset management, which we'll be talking with Peter about. We have a discussion on the Institute of Asset Management and ALN paper, Asset Management Leadership, a white paper. And then also this is our first Thursday at 3 where CGI is a patron sponsor. So welcome to CGI and all of your staff and executives. And so Peter Kohler is a luminary in asset management, and we've had the privilege of having him on and having great insights from him in the past. And we've got this upcoming program we're going to talk about in a bit, but we've never really done a deep dive into, Peter, how did you get here in your asset management journey? So let's start off with that background question.
Well, thank you. Thank you again for allowing me to participate. I do enjoy these sort of conversations. Maybe not so much the one today when I have to talk about myself a bit, but just very quickly, I'm an engineer by background, engineering degree, that usual stuff, and joined the Navy when I was 18, did 24 years in Navy, and the last 5 years were the years where I came into this discipline called asset management, and that was only because, would you believe, on Tuesday, I think it was Tuesday the 11th of August 1990, I was sitting in my office. I was a commander engineer in the Navy, and the phone rang, and on the end of the phone was the Chief of Naval Staff. In other words, the head of Navy. No, I'd never spoken to him before in my life, right? And other than the usual commands type stuff. And he rang me up and said, Peter, I'd like you to do a small task for me. And so 10 minutes later, I found myself in front of a person called the General Manager, Garden Island Dockyard, and that was the dockyard looked after all the Navy ships. There were 3 dockyards in Australia that looked after all the Navy ships. I walked in there and said those ubiquitous words that I'm authorized personally by the Chief of Naval Staff to tell you the following. And the following went like this. That is, the Prime Minister on Thursday is going to announce that Australia is going to join the effort to get rid of Saddam Hussein. If you remember that, back to 1990. Australia was going to send 3 ships. The Prime Minister would announce that too. And would you please turn the dockyard on in relation to whatever we needed to do to get those ships ready to go to the Gulf. And that was my entire speech to the general manager. The other thing I importantly said, and by the way, the cost codes where you can begin to charge all this effort to will be sent to you tomorrow. He was really interested in that. The following Friday, I was in a joint intelligence briefing in Canberra at 8:30 in the evening, and that lasted till about 11 o'clock at the evening. And the JO briefing was all about what the situation in Middle East. 5 o'clock in the morning, I was at the RAAF, this is the Royal Australian Air Force Base in Canberra, waiting to join one of the VIP flight aircraft to the Middle East, because commercially you couldn't get to the Middle East then because all the companies weren't flying through the Middle East. So we had to use one of the RAAF VIP aircraft, which is the best flying I've ever done in my life, I have to admit. So it was first class plus, right, in the VIP aircraft. And we went to the Middle East. But at 5 o'clock in the morning, I was sitting there waiting to get onto this aircraft, and someone came up to me and asked, would I please sign for this? I said, what am I signing for? And they said, a credit card. And I said, how many other people in the team? Because only a team of 4 people going to the Middle East. I was one of the team of 4. And I said, how many other team are getting to sign getting a credit card as well? And they said, oh, no one. You're the only one. Okay. And as I'm signing for it, I thought I should ask the next relevant question, which is, what's the credit limit? You give me a credit card, what's the credit limit? And he looked at me, he said, the GDP of Australia. And that's when I knew this situation was real. Yeah. Long story short, I did my job in the Middle East, and it was just to set everything up, right? But my job was to look at all the engineering facilities around in the Middle East and make recommendations as to who we might use, where we would base the ships, all that sort of stuff in the Middle East. Yeah, that all support the ships from. Then I came back to Australia and then was involved in and had direct involvement in and was accountable for modifying the ships to meet the requirement. Okay, we had 2 months or a month, that sort of stuff, to modify the ships. And during that process, that's when I realized how much I did not know as an engineer. Yeah. And one of the reasons I got into AM was because I had a team then in those days that looked after all the maintenance programs for all the ships in Navy. Now there was 10 or 12 people involved in just doing the administrative stuff for that. The dockyard did all the modifications to the maintenance program. But I asked this team, I said, because it occurred to me that if we're going to send the ships to the Middle East, lots of things are different in there. The way they're going to be used is different, absolutely. The environmental differences are different. So I asked them, should we change the maintenance program? If so, how? If not, why? That's what I actually asked them. And their response was, and I couldn't say too much about that because that was why I was asking. I didn't know the answer to that as well. Long story short, I realized through that whole process, and I don't want to take too much time, but what I didn't know, and one of the things that I did to find out how to know all the things I didn't know was I bought myself because Navy, I could use some money from Navy, bought myself a jute box of CDs. On those CDs were about 67 CDs. On those CDs were all the ISO IEC standards, all the IEEE standards, all the EIA standards, all the US MIL standards, all the NASA standards. And so when anyone used a dirty word like reliability, I would write that word down, go back to my office, turn the machine on, because it had a great indexing system. And I said, show me the standards that use the word reliability in its heading or in its foreword. And then I'd print those and read them. And that's when I started to realize how much I didn't know. Does that make sense?
Oh,
and
yes.
As a result of that, I then said, oh, I need to talk to other people about this, and then met a number of other people. And that eventually, with a couple of other people, morphed into the Maintenance Engineering Society of Australia. And then Maintenance Engineering Society of Australia morphed into the Asset Management Council about 25 years ago. Right, so I was part of that as well, all that change. And so I realized two things out of this. My engineering training was very poor. I'm publicly stating my engineering training is very poor, but my naval engineering training was even worse. Yeah, what they didn't tell me about, well, I believe what they should have, in order to deal with the situation I was in, how did I deal with that? As a result of all that, starting to learn, starting to look at things a different way, I was involved in my last 5 years in Navy and changing quite a bit. Navy under the Royal Australian Navy took this opportunity to say, I don't think we're as good as we thought we were. And because no one, it was a very benign war from a Navy point of view, relatively benign. So all the ships came back, all the guys came back. And when they did, we as a senior management team, which I moved into, we were constantly sat down and said, we need to improve. We need to do things differently. So a lot of things changed as a result of that. Many things changed. Our organizationals changed. But what really happened out of all of that was the understanding of the value of leadership and culture, as you're just about to talk to, right? Management of data, absolutely. What data did we have? We didn't know. Where how many what equipment is on the ship? Well, we kind of knew, but when you actually scratch the surface, we really didn't know because you didn't have data standards and things like that. All that sort of stuff, all that foundational stuff that I keep harping about. You've heard me harp about, Mike, came from that period because I'm emotionally committed to that because I realized, as an individual, I didn't know a lot. The Navy didn't know a lot either, and a lot of people don't like me saying that. But unless you're absolutely totally honest about these things, nothing ever happens. Yeah, so that's where it all started, Mike. So yeah, you asked for
Well,
that.
yes, I did. And what you're describing is what the world has consistently received, which is a defense dividend. That
Yep.
we put a lot of money into our defense because security is very important to people. And
Yep.
then the advancements that develop in the military come through to the rest of the world. And I see that very much in asset management in
Well,
the US.
there's two industries, and two industries I always look up to. One is the US defense standards, or US defense, the DoD military standards, US mil standards, I call them US military standards, and they were on the CT things that I was, and they're free, right? I mean, I love the US for a number of aspects. This sort of information is free. The rest of the world you have to pay for it, but the US standards are free, and I still use those standards. They're many years old, but technically they're very good, very, very good the way they're put together. Someone spent a lot of money putting those standards together because when I read them, I still go, wow, that's really wow, the way they talked like this, the way they did that is really cool. The other industry is aviation. Aviation to me is another industry I look up to, and particularly from aviation, the leadership and culture stuff. The culture stuff. I mean, I've worked in. I won't say the company where people actually do practice the right culture. And I've worked in a number of aviation places over the years, and to not so much witness, but actually hear people talk, and when a maintainer makes a mistake, put their hands up, and the no blame culture, all that stuff comes into play, and people, we need to fix something, right? It's not the individual we're going to hammer. There's something wrong with the system, so we need to fix this, and that all relates to, of course, the system, but also the individuals and people within that. And then I won't mention the company, of course, but I can remember working there as a consultant and hearing the story that one of the senior captains self-reported making a mistake and then took himself off the flight line so that he could then go back and do some training. And I've never forgotten that. I heard that and went, oh, that's the company I want to fly with. You understand? That's the right attitude. Yeah. So leadership and culture. I learned that in the Navy in those last 5 years, how Navy really did have to work on that, and we did work on that. There's another interesting several hours of conversation there. That's fascinating, absolutely fascinating to me as an engineer, what I didn't know in relation to people, leadership, and culture. Yeah, as an example. At
Well,
the time, didn't know.
I'm going to hop over our upcoming event and say that the following value and benefits from asset leadership, we have scheduled defense. So someone from a defense organization in Australia and someone from a defense organization in the US will be presenting on the value and benefits from asset management. But focusing on this upcoming one on February 7th in the US, but February 8th in Australia, is speaking of data as an asset.
Yeah.
And Kimono Numa, the president of our Platinum member, emailed me and said, Mike, are there any ROI statistics on asset management that I can share with the Department of State, was who he was talking with, and wanted to get them to push forward more with asset management. And I said, well, let me check with Peter Kohler. And Peter got back to me and said, let's talk about this, because we've been wanting to do something for years on this. And if we turn this request into a webinar series, we can build a database of success stories to encourage other owners to pursue a structured approach to asset management. And that is about almost 2 years ago now, not quite 2 years. But we've been having these programs on the value and benefits of asset management. Peter, Sally Nugent, and myself put together a template of PowerPoint slides that everyone has to use the same. so that we can build a database, and people have to answer, what is the context of your organization? What are the objectives? What are your measurements? Are there any unexpected results? So it's a very popular program.
Yeah.
Peter, can you talk a little bit about the attendance from Australia?
Well, for all the webinars that the AM Council does, this one is the highest rating. Yeah, there's such a lot of interest from, I guess, people like ourselves that are in the industry. Sorry, because it's just so important. I mean, it gets to the heart of why you do things. You do things because hopefully it adds value. Yeah, and so what is that? What is it that we're adding? That's a really important question. Have I wasted, 30 years of my life? Yeah, and I don't think the answer is yes, but maybe we can do better than what we've been doing as well by answering these questions as well, Mike. So I think it's fundamentally important. It's also about things like, we have the ISO standards, ISO 55000, 55001, 55002, and there's a whole bunch of how-to standards. It's one of the reasons I work in the IEC, International Electric Technical Commission, because that's all about the how do you do asset management. ISO standards is about the what and why, and then the IEC is about the how. In other words, how do you do a FAMICA? How do you apply RCM? What risk-based analytical techniques are there around? And there's quite a few, but but what's the value in doing all that? Why bother doing all that stuff? At the end of the day, what have you done, and what have you achieved? So, really important story to highlight. That 55001 and all those standards I just mentioned, I'm not going to mention them all clearly, not all the how-tos. Why bother with all this stuff? And it's a hugely important question to answer, because ISO doesn't know the answer either, interestingly enough. This is so how do you convince someone that adopting an ISO standard and going through all the hard yards, spending all the money, what's the value? What are you going to achieve at the end of it? Which also raises some interesting issues. Why is it that the ISO 55000 doesn't include money directly, right? Because this is a whole bunch of the answer may well be, for example, that this is a whole bunch of engineers doing engineering stuff, and that's not related to the way businesses work. That sort of stuff. Yeah, but as we're knowing, as we realize, Mike, that going through, we've already done 6 or 7, I think, of the series.
Yes.
We do one every 3 months. So because it does take time to find the right people who have answers which we're comfortable with. Yeah, anyone can make up answers. I'm not suggesting that, but there's got to be some substance behind the material, and so that's really interesting, isn't it? That whole process of finding companies and then getting the answers to the questions, then talking about it. Yeah.
So that's a perfect lead-in for discussing John Hardwick and why you and Sally wanted John to present.
Well, John has a fantastically interesting background. He's electrician by background, trading, and realized that maybe he wasn't so good at the light switches, but maybe doing something better. And he rose to. I met him some years ago, quite a few years ago, when I was a consultant. I'd left Navy, and he was in a power distribution company at the time in Sydney, in Ausgrid, and really interesting story. In 2 seconds, I got involved because he was working for a maintenance manager, and the company had a new CEO, and the John was working for the maintenance manager of that company, okay, and so they're having problems. And the new CEO had a word with the maintenance manager. I won't mention his name, but said to the maintenance manager, because the maintenance manager said, I'd love to, we should spend some more money on this because this is blah 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 blah. And the CEO said, fine, yep, not a problem. Bring it to the board and we'll discuss it there. Yeah, which essentially, and then the maintenance manager at the time thought he'd won. Yeah, thought he'd won, and he thought about that for about half a day, then realised, oh, I'm now going to be in front of the CEO and the board arguing for more money. I have to be able to articulate what the benefit of the spending money is. You understand? So the CEO is very clever. Right. But what happened there was really interesting. The maintenance manager resigned because he didn't know how to address the question of more money and what benefit that would bring the company. And then they brought in a number of consultants. I was one of those. And that's where I met John Hardwick. And John Hardwick eventually took all that over, and he became the maintenance guru for that organization, because he could, and I and many others, sat down together. I remember having numerous sessions with all these people. How do you articulate, if I want to spend some more money or less money, whatever, what the impact is, right? So you have to be able to argue what the impact is on the business, not technically, what more reliability you get out of it. Well, that's part of the journey, but then you have to articulate that reliability is going to deliver X, Y, Z other returns. And that's why I met John, and he actually implemented all that within that company, turned that company from to a raging success, a world beater. He'll tell you the story, and then he's moved on from there. So his focus on data, his focus on process, his focus on people, leadership, and culture comes in the one box. Yeah, it's rare that you find all that in the one person that understands that environment very, very well. And John has a persona associated with him that allows him to be able to talk to people, not down at people. Yeah, so there's a number of reasons why John Hardwick has achieved what he has, and a number of reasons why I always like getting him on and talking about these sorts of things as well, because he has a fantastic background in many of the things that we think are important. Data is one part of that. Leadership and culture, he can talk for days on that subject. We only have 20 minutes or so to talk to him about data, but he's, hopefully when you come to Australia soon, you can meet him, and you can see why. Yeah.
So when Sally and Peter were telling me about John and what he would be talking about, I thought, Kimono Numa and what he's doing for the Los Angeles Community College District would be a perfect pairing, because Kimon is a single person who understands so much of this also. He's not on the owner's side, but he strongly influences the owners. And he's been working with the California community colleges for 12 or 15 years. And Los Angeles Community College specifically is taking up his concepts and implementing them more so than any of the other sub-districts in California community colleges. So he'll be able to talk about keeping the data from the planning. And it's about, we're saying data in the title, but basically it's meaning, intention. And he shows how to take the initial information from a planning meeting and making it available throughout the entire life cycle of the asset. And it's usually a building, but it's also all the assets inside the building and the assets that come into the building, and the water and the wastewater and the electricity too. He models all of this so that leaders can have a clear understanding of what the situation is, and people can say, I see what you're talking about relative to very complex subjects. So I think it's going to be a really exciting program.
Yeah. One of the interesting aspects about that too, Mike, is that, I've been in companies where leadership doesn't want people to know. And so it comes back to leadership and culture yet again. Yes, you can have all the great systems in the world, but if the culture doesn't support that and the leadership doesn't, wow. Yeah. So all these things have to come as I agree. All these boxes have to be ticked, in other words, for all this thing, for the discipline to work well. So yes, you like I are looking forward to next week, because the fundamentals of how you make a decision is using the right data, and having that open and available to everyone is hugely important, and being clear what it is. I mean, I've been to so many organizations where, we got the data, but you ask someone what it is, what does this data represent, piece of information represent, and it's not clear, and that doesn't help either. So there's a whole interesting, I'm sure between our two speakers next week, it'll be a good conversation, actually. Yeah.
Yes, and let's take a moment to talk about AM Peak, the annual Asset Management Council Conference, and the fact that we're going to be presenting together on value and benefits from asset management, April 2nd through 5th. I don't know what day we're speaking. We've got just a little bit more time. Then I hope you can stick around a little bit longer. We'll do a formal ending, but I'd like to make Jim Dieter and Jack Kelly panelists. Since we've got you up early in the morning, let's talk with some of your old friends. because Jim wants to know why you're not on the back porch with the parrots, and he
Oh,
probably
they're
doesn't
still
know
asleep. They're still asleep. That's why.
Oh, okay. Okay, so there's a whole section of the AM Peak conference called Value and Benefits, isn't there?
Yes. And that's due to UI and Sally doing these webinars, because people have realized how important the answers are. Yeah, does that make sense? And within Australia too, just interestingly enough, JASANS, which is the organisation joint Australia and New Zealand, JASANS. Australia and New Zealand, people are not aware from the States may not aware, but you know we call the difference, we call the piece of water between Australia and New Zealand the moat, so because you know. I don't know, it's 800 miles. It's a big moat, but anyway, we often do things together. So JASANS is the organisation that's responsible for 55,001, promoting that in Australia, and they are talking to the AIM Council as well in relation to how can we improve the sale and improve the benefit to the community associated with the application of 55,001. So there's a whole bunch of people asking questions related to the value and benefits of asset management, Mike, and that's a conversation that's been happening in Australia for a few years. So, yeah, and will continue, of course, whilst you have whilst you're insisting that people buy these. Well, I'm not insisting, nor are you, but someone's insisting that people have to buy these standards. Yeah. So you've got to be assured they're going to achieve some value, right? Now, how you implement it, that's another matter. And the two speakers next week, every speaker we have talks about that journey of how do you implement that, and that's an important part of this process as well. You know, how did they achieve what they did in the organization? So it's something we've recorded as well in that database. Yeah.
And people have talked about the organizations they've worked with where there wasn't success, or
Absolutely.
What we're finding over and over, and we're going to try to figure out a way to focus on this, how failure forces a structured approach to asset management to make sure that the failure does not happen again. And what we're thinking of is how to highlight all the failures so that organizations that haven't failed yet don't. So again, it's not about the actual turning the wrenches and the preventive maintenance. People actually have that down pretty well. Like you said, all those standards exist. It's a matter of getting the leadership to insist on the culture of using them. And I think
the value of using them. Why have standards? Why have standards? And it'll, next week when we talk about data, the issue of data standards is going to come up. So companies to rely on data, you have to have a data standard. Otherwise, you don't know the value of the data. Should I use this data to make a decision? That's another interesting question. Can I use this? Should I use this? Should, maybe yes, but can I? Oh, don't know. So it comes back to data standards as well.
So I really would love Jack Kelly and Jim Dieter to agree to join us. If you could send us a instant message to give us permission to make you a panelist. And I will start the formal ending by thanking Peter for getting up early in Australia to talk with us, and Nick can come on and do the official ending, and I'll see if I can get Jim says sure, and we'll work on Jack Kelly.
Awesome. Well, yeah, before we close, we just want to thank our ALN Platinum organizational member, Onuma System, as well as our other patron members, especially CGI, a new patron member, and other organizational members. All of you help make this possible. And we are really glad to be here doing this, having these interesting conversations with interesting people all over the world every week. And so just want to also mention this upcoming event. We've been talking about another event a week following this one, but this will be Tuesday, February 7th. So don't miss
I'm really excited about this one now after everything Peter said.
Yeah, John Hardwick certainly seems even more interesting now that we've heard a little about him.
That puts the onus on us to ask the right questions, Mike. Yep.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
All right, I'm promoting Jim. You can promote Jack.
Okay, there should be incoming.
There we go. So Jim
Jack's high in the air. Yeah.
Jim had a question about fundamentals and principles.
Oh. Yes, I saw that. I just wanted to ignore that question. Yeah. Go on to the easy one.
Wasn't it a simple question? You know, and I remember you were the expert on this in the first go around for ISO 55000. So
go on, ask the question, Jim. Go on, go on.
well, what's the difference? And you know, so the background is in the development of the 2014 version of 55000, we had this section on principles, and Peter insisted that it should be called fundamentals appropriately. And you know, even though the document is entitled principles, so I mean, he overcame a lot, and that's what it was called. So we got to the revision, and Peter isn't playing with us anymore. So when we were having this discussion, I said, "Well, Peter had some reason, but I can't remember what it was." So I mean,
so it's
I'll
an actual.
I'll tell you now.
question.
I go on, Mike.
It's an important question. It's still relevant to ISO 55000.
Well, I'm going to burst your bubble here because I don't think it's relevant at all. But I don't think I don't think the word fundamental or principle is just to be honest. It's in many respects it's just a name for something. It's a collective noun of some kind, or a word that implies some collective idea. But at the end of the day, whatever we call them, fundamentals or principles, they're the foundational elements of our management system. Why are we doing stuff? I've always viewed there's a cascading series of requirements when you think about 55,000, and the first stuff is you know, what are the foundational elements that the business needs, and the set in 55,000 is not the full set. It's just what we might call a minimum set that most every management system would have, but based on the organizational context, there may be more. So it's for the organization to determine, but the ISO standard can't do that. It has to talk about the idea of these things existing, and here's a set that might represent a minimum that you can look at that every organization should apply. Those things become requirements on the management system, on the strategic asset management plan. Right, so the SAMP has to implement those fundamentals or principles. I don't care what name, fundamentals or principles. And within the SAMP, those would be implemented in a whole bunch of processes and data and all the stuff we just talked about. Yeah. So for me, there's a cascade. More importantly, there's a cascading series of requirements that those fundamental principles are the start of. In order to understand what those fundamentals and principles are, though, you have to look at the environment in which the business works. So you'd have to look at the strat plan of the environment. You have to talk to the stakeholders. So it's all about understanding, you know, the business environment, doing that sweep every now and again. Are these the same today as they were yesterday? Are there more or less than they are today? And you're seeing that in the way, what I hear anyway, in relation to what the discussion in relation to the numbers of those things in 55,001, you know, in the various drafts. I have not seen all the various drafts, but I've heard people within Australia talk about them. And I, you know, genuinely believe that, you know, when society changes, as it always does, maybe those principles change as well. Or fundamentals change. I don't care what language, but they do represent, you know, your understanding of that environment, and those requirements then have to be implemented by the company's management system. That to me is the important thing, not what we call them. Is that unfortunately, to burst your bubble a bit, Jim? Sorry.
Jack.
So quickly, I've heard of people being, you know, a person of principles. I've never heard of people being a person of fundamentals.
I would agree. But people have fundamental beliefs.
Right.
And, you know, what's the difference between a fundamental belief and a principle? I don't want to get into that, you know, but but it's, to me, as I said, it's more important to have that conversation in relation to, you know, the environment the organization works in, the things that are really important for that environment. Maybe that's another way we can talk about principles or fundamentals, and how those then need to be applied, be seen to be applied within the management system itself. Because these things don't exist in isolation from anything else. They're not they don't magically occur. They occur because we understand, hopefully the organization understands the environment it's working in. I use my hands a lot, sorry, but anyway, I got to, in this environment, it's not good to keep using my hands like this, but it's important to understand the environment that the organization works in.
And
Sorry,
just
Jack. Yeah.
one last thought is, I think we're also seeing that at least from an asset management perspective, the operative definition and understanding of words changes and has changed just in the, the 10 years, 9 years now.
Yeah.
Standard came out.
I
Thinking of sustainability in particular.
Yeah, I mean, no language ever remains static, no. And this is all part of a good thing about writing standards, isn't it, Jim? That you never have, you always have opportunities to talk. That's right. That's and discuss and learn. And the important part about that, as you know, is the discuss bit and the learning bit. Yeah.
Now, I know many people, though, that say that at least seem to be applying the principle or fundamental that words can be used with mathematical precision and have one meaning and one way to be understood.
Well, that's a nice view of the world. I wouldn't necessarily think that works very well, but I mean, I don't know what the United States is like, but there are words in Australia used in one state, used in another, and they have completely different meanings. So you've got to be cognizant of those kind of issues. And if you're writing an international standard, oh my goodness me, yeah, there are twice as many as there are countries in the world views of one word. So it's always one of the great joys, isn't it, Jim and Jack, of working in standards, those kind of issues. You suddenly realize that your own view of the world is a little bit narrow, possibly, and or the other way around sometimes as well. Rarely, but yeah.
Jack, you've always said Australia is quite advanced in asset management. Wasn't that something learning about Peter's role in moving them forward?
Oh, Peter and I have talked about some of his origin stories for a while, and they're just fascinating. And Peter, what Mike is talking about, Peter, is every time I have an opportunity to do so, I say that in my limited understanding of asset management around the world, Australia is the gold standard. And one of the things that I use to demonstrate that is the fact that you have a national infrastructure plan. That to me, you have to be, well, first of all, you're the only country that I know of that actually has one, much less the fact that two of your major states also have state infrastructure plans, which it's a huge, that's like a SAMP on a countrywide level. And it's extraordinary that y'all have gotten to that point.
Well, yeah, it's not perfect, but without a national plan and a state plan, I don't know how you can have a national plan without various state plans.
Right.
And there's a recognition in Australia that that's really quite important. If you're going to spend a few $1 billion doing stuff, it better be coordinated between the federal government and state governments. I mean, what's the bloody point? There are a number of, I can point you to a number of places. YouTube's an interesting phenomena, but certainly in Australia, there's a lot of people interested in transport and other things. I mean, it's a big country like the United States, so transport stuff is fundamental to getting it right. If you get transport wrong, the GDP of Australia suffers, and or if you get it right, it actually improves the GDP of Australia. It's that recognition that is really important, and that's what those plans ultimately represent. And in Australia, it's not perfect. I mean, we still get politicians beating certain drums, and hopefully, once you get over the noise of the drums, you can then have conversations with them and say, yeah, I understand where you're coming from, but perhaps though, this might be a way of looking at it. Yeah, and that there's always been that opportunity for. So far, there's always been that opportunity for conversation, and that's fundamentally important. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure the things that we lead the world in, except maybe the size of our GDP, or certainly maybe the size of our national debt is probably the thing that we lead the world in. But it's we're nowhere close to where you guys are. That's why I hold you up as a shining example.
you pointed out that Peter has boomeranged your comments back to the US, and he did a good job today of saying that our military has good standards and that he based much of what he was doing on that.
And the same with the FAA. I mean, I look up to, personally look up to what the FAA does now. No institution is perfect, but yes.
Yeah, well, Peter was, when Michael Hardy and I wrote that history of asset management, Peter was a huge and invaluable source of perspective and information. I learned more about the U.S. from Peter than I learned about from anybody else.
I would say one thing. And I've said this to Jack before. One of Australia, if we think we're okay at this, which is that's an interesting issue. But one of the benefits Australia has had, and over many years, I mentioned earlier in a conversation with Mike before we started the formal part of today, was a lady by the name of Penny Burns in Australia, Dr. Penny Burns, and she's in her middle 80s, and Jack knows her. I don't know whether you do, Jim. I don't know whether you've met her, but she was one of the economists in Australia that introduced 45 years ago accrual accounting. And I actually personally, once I understood the role of accounting in Australia, which as an engineer, I never really did. So one of the really learnings that I came across even when I was in the Navy, it was when I started looking at the Navy. One of the things that the Chief of Naval Staff had me do was actually participate in a financial planning session. And I found that when he asked me at the end of the 2 days, he asked me what my view was. And I said, I was astounded. In what way? No one talked about what the dollars was going to buy. We all talked about a budget and money, but no one actually related the money to the output. Yeah. And accrual accounting, money to output. So that's when I started, I needed to learn more how to do this and better. But I realized at the same time, I didn't know enough. And so people like Penny Burns and others, but she, was one of the, believe me, guiding lights in Australia into the introduction of accrual accounting. And that's made a fundamental difference to the conversations that are being had. It's not a technical issue anymore. It's a technical and financial issue if you want to get to, the benefit. Yeah.
Well, Peter, one of the things that I learned that also from the conversations with you and Penny is that accrual accounting was half of the story. The other half of the story was the way that the balance sheet, perspective. Looking at a balance sheet and seeing the what's the term? It's the fair value of assets, which can go up or down depending on how well you maintain those assets, and also, only maintain the assets that are critical to your mission. So it's
yes, and that we can, yes.
Anyway, so
it's not just
the whole accounting.
But it's not just about the fair value of the assets; it's about what the assets bring to the business. Yeah, and right. So fair value assets is one thing. That's what you can sell them for. But essentially, it's actually what the assets bring to the business. So if this asset disappeared, what would happen? Right. And it's that understanding that's hugely important. And accrual accounting helps with that as well.
I find it fascinating.
Key to that, not just helps, key.
I find it fascinating how similar Peter's journey and thoughts mirror in Jack Dempsey, who came up through the Coast Guard and identified these things that needed to be learned and then had the impact. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, yes, he was part of the team that put 55,000 together some years ago as well, and so it was interesting talking to Jack about his experiences. My left eyebrow raises when I hear something interesting. So my left eyebrow was raising quite a bit having over conversations with Jack over the years. They haven't been always long conversations, but I've seen a couple of his presentations on the ALN. So yeah.
We know that's not true. You cannot have a short conversation with Jack Dempsey. It's just not possible. And
a relative term.
And like this conversation with you, it's always fascinating. So gentlemen, Jim and Jack, do you have any other comments or questions for Peter?
No, it's always a joy for me to hear what he has to say, because he's always bringing new stuff to the table, at least to my table.
All right.
It points out the fundamental difference between in-person meetings and virtual meetings. Is after the meeting's over, you can't sit down and have a beer.
Yeah, I would agree. I know I think I know where you're coming from, Jim. Yes, absolutely. One of the joys of the ISO thing is not so much the formal sessions; it's the conversations that happen in the bar afterwards, or in the park afterwards, or a coffee house afterwards, because that's when you really begin to understand, isn't it? Yeah, when you understand. I was said, working with ISO, there's a very good phrase someone once told me, and I've always remembered it. And it goes like this: for me to understand, for me to be understood, first I must understand you. Yeah, and in other words, how are you going to interpret these things that I'm saying? So I need to be aware of that in order so that I can get my point across. Yeah, and that we can then have a conversation. And that's what Jim's talking about now. It's the coffees afterwards and the conversations afterwards where you begin to understand the individuals, and then you can have a conversation that's useful. Yeah. But Zooming and virtual is very difficult because you don't get those personal conversations where you learn about each other.
Well, thank you, Peter, for joining us for this very personal conversation where I did learn a lot about you. I did not know, as much of your backstory as I do now. So I appreciate you getting up early, and we'll let you get going. I know you're always busy. Thank you so much for joining us. Jim and Jack, thanks for joining. Nick, thanks for producing.
Mike, there's one thing about Peter that you're going to learn when you go to Australia.
He's tall.
That's exactly right. He is really tall.
Jack Dempsey told me that one. So I've been trying to evaluate. Anyway, so no, I really look forward. Peter and Sally basically twisted my arm and said I had to come to Sydney, and I appreciate them for doing so.
I've also already, by the way, Mike, had word with the board of the AIM Council that you're coming. So we are going to be talking about you at the board level and the ALN next 3 weeks, 2 weeks, something like that. So I'm going to be talking to the board about all these things as well. So that they're keen to develop,
further
talk to you a bit
relationship.
more. Talk to you a bit more. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Let's do that. And something that Jim has come up with, even though it's just draft form. I don't know if I should say that. Jim's coming up with a real good strategic plan for the Asset Leadership Network, and I hope to present it in person. Take 5 minutes to go over it as part of our presentation. But perhaps we can get you some materials before those meetings if you feel anything would be useful.
Yeah, both Sally and I. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Okay.
And thank you to the audience and the people today who are watching and the people in the future. We appreciate your interest.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye for now.